So welcome everyone in the room and online to Session 3, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation on Australian Farms, Agricultural Policy and the Net Zero Challenge. I am Jo Sanson. I think some people are just taking a seat. So I am Jo Sanson, Program Impact Manager at Climate Work Centre for the Land Use Futures Program. I work closely with Anna Scarbeck, the CEO of Climate Work Centre, who was intending to be the moderator for this session, but unfortunately was unable to make it in person, which I know she's very sorry about. I'd like to start acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners and elders of the Ngunnawal people on whose lands we're meeting, and the traditional owners from where our online audiences are calling in from. And also to thank them for their historical and continuing care for country, a practice and worldview we have much to learn from. So Climate Work Centre is an independent not-for-profit co-founded by Monash University and the Maya Foundation, working within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We specialise in net zero pathways, policy and practice. Our Land Use Futures program was established to provide analysis and advice on what a sustainable food and land use system can look like for Australia. The upgrade of the land use trade-offs model, or LUTO2 as we call it, with our collaborators at Deakin University, has been a central tenet of our program. LUTO2 is a spatial optimisation model designed to provide detailed spatial analysis of how Australia can meet projected agricultural demand while meeting climate and biodiversity targets and avoiding water stress. So we're very cognizant of the magnitude of the complexity associated with balancing these goals, much which we'll be discussing today. So I feel very privileged and excited to be introducing this session. The next 90 minutes will run in 3 parts, roughly of half an hour each. Firstly, we'll hear about 2 major climate change and net zero related plans. The Australian Government's Agricultural and Land Sectoral Plan, which Adam Fennessy mentioned this morning, and the joint DAF CSIRO work programme Ag 2050. With 2 10-minute presentations and 10 minutes for you to ask questions of the 2 presenters together. Second, we will have 4 panellists discussing their industry-facing work in agricultural's net zero challenge and solutions. And third, after their 4 presentations, there will be another Q&A session. So that's your opportunity to contribute by submitting questions in the online app or from the floor. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Nick Blong, First Assistant Secretary, Sustainability, Climate and Strategy in DAF. Nick is leading a program of work across climate adaptation and emissions, as well as sustainable agricultural policies, and has a background including WTO negotiations and public and private sector roles. He holds an agricultural economics degree and a master's in international law. Nick will give us an update about the Ag and Land Sector Net Zero Plan. This is a very significant undertaking this year, one of 6 national sector net zero plans being developed, as Adam noted this before lunch. So Nick will cover the processes involved, themes from the consultation processes, and opportunities and impediments. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks for having me here today. We're off to a flying start. We couldn't get the lid off the water bottle, and I've now spilt water across the table, so we'll see how we go. So yes, delighted to sort of be kicking off this afternoon session after lunch, and wanted to give you a quick rundown on where we're at in the net zero space, particularly around the Agriculture and Land Sector Plan, which I think Adam might have mentioned earlier. And so I just want to quickly go over sort of what we're talking about when we talk about net zero sort of in the agriculture context. The process where sort of got underway around consultations on the Ag and Land Plan, as we sort of call it colloquially. And so, certainly what we're sort of hearing from our discussions to date, and hopefully then that leads into some hard questions which Rose can answer. So very quickly, so as many of you will know, must be sort of 6-9 months ago now, the government committed to sort of a net zero planning process, which, as a number of people have mentioned now, involves 6 sectoral plans. I'm going to do my best to read them off the top of my head. Electricity and energy, transport, the built environment, industry, resources, and the Ag and Land Plan. I'm not sure if that's 6, but someone can pull me up if I've missed one. But of course, the Ag and Land Plan is the one that we at DAF are sort of very much leading across government and to be honest, have been talking non-stop almost since about November last year when we released our public consultation paper. And I guess going back a step, why are we doing this? Well, for starters, agriculture accounts today about 17% of our national greenhouse gas emissions. On the flip side, of course, what agriculture has that no other part of the economy has is land. And land, of course, provides enormous carbon sequestration opportunities. And as of today, the land sector is a net sink to the tune of about minus 13 or so % of national emissions. So there is this constant balancing act between agriculture and the food and fibre production that is critical to our regions and food security, international trade, etc., but also the land sector and land management and land use change, which is very much part of the carbon sequestration story, which I'm happy to talk about further later on. So the reason we want to make sure agriculture, and I should proudly say that the Agriculture and Land Sector Plan discussion paper was the first out of the blocks as part of the net zero exercise in November. And we've, as I said, been speaking almost constantly to stakeholders in industry and different partners, different levels of government, and that simply just reflects the breadth of interest in this space or across the entire supply chain. So I think it's fair to say there's definitely a unanimous view that there's lots of opportunities here, but also it's not straightforward. And I think that is also reflected in the fact that typically when you're just looking at the agriculture side of the ledger, our agriculture's emissions basically go up and down with production cycles. So good seasons, like some of the charts we saw earlier, emissions tend to trend upwards, and then in dry periods as herd numbers decrease and crop production falls off a bit, then our emissions go down. So there's that coupling effect between production and emissions. So certainly something we're looking at is how we address that and what some of the long-term initiatives we might need to put in place to help decouple that in time. Certainly, like reflecting on some of our ministers' comments in this space in launching the sector plan work late last year, there was a very firm framing, and this is something we hold ourselves true to, is really around this. This is around opportunity and lifting production and profitability. It's also about making sure that we, as a big exporter of food and fibre, stay true to our climate smart credentials. We are on many measurements a relatively low emissions producer of food and fibre compared to a lot of our trading partners and competitors, which is good, but also we can't stand still and just expect that to continue. So a big part of the challenge over the long term is making sure that we look and work hard across the sector to make sure that we stay ahead of the pack as much as possible. And there's also the land side, so making sure the carbon storage, the land sequestration opportunities are present as well, and that's certainly come through in some of the consultations we've had to date. One caveat to all this is that we're not talking about agriculture being net zero by 2050 or any other date for that matter. This is more around the net zero 2050 target. It's a whole of economy target, so it's really important to make sure the agriculture and land sector has a clear defined pathway forward in terms of how it contributes to those whole of economy goals. So it's not about setting sector specific targets, although we have heard some feedback that those type of subsector targets may be warranted, but the government's made clear that it's something that's not being looked at the moment. We're also not starting from scratch, so industries and many state and territory governments have been very busy in this space with a whole suite of both R&D initiatives. Many industries and sectors have their own targets, carbon neutral 30 for instance, or emissions intensity reduction targets over the short to medium term as well across many of our sectors. So there's been a lot of investment and a lot of thinking done across the agriculture system, which is fantastic. So we're not starting from scratch. So certainly something we're looking at from a sector plan perspective is how we bring these different parts of the system together to tell a quite coherent story about what the future looks like, both short to medium term and and beyond. So that's something that's occupying a lot of our space at the moment too. As I said, we had about 230 submissions which I think in the scheme of things may not sound like a lot, but I think certainly what struck us and the team was the breadth of interest we had from across the supply chain. A lot of individual submissions from farmers and landholders, peak industry bodies, not-for-profit organisations, many private businesses from across the supply chain. So I think they're important things for us to reflect on, that while the sector plan is constructed sort of around the farm gate and what happens on farmland and the land sector more broadly, there's strong interest from across the supply chain to make sure we sort of get these settings and parameters right. And I think that's something we really want to focus on, to make sure that the whole supply chain and value chain for food and fibre in this country is working together in the same direction, and also not duplicating effort, and where there's opportunities to sort of harvest some low-hanging fruit and work together on solutions and posture, we can do so. So that's certainly something front of mind as well. So reflecting on some key themes, certainly we're hearing that the need for sort of greater literacy and understanding of sort of farm level greenhouse gas emissions is important. I guess as a bit of a side, New Zealand's gone down the path of, I think it's got about a dozen different sort of on-farm calculators that are available at the moment, which sort of produce different numbers depending on sort of which ones you use. So we sort of want to make sure we can sort of learn some lessons from some of our competitors and trading partners, including those across the ditch. So they're sort of simple things. Well, they're not simple, but they're low-hanging fruit things that we think we can work with the industry on, hopefully over the not too distant future, to address some of those obstacles that might be sort of impeding progress. Certainly around the R&D space, there's sort of, we're hearing, is the R&D sort of effort sort of all aligned around sort of addressing the mitigation task, and also sort of tapping into sort of what's happening again in some of our big trading partners. So there's sort of interest there. And I guess that making sure the innovation system and the research, the commercialisation, extension, adoption, which are not new things to sort of those that have worked in the agriculture space for a long time, looking at and making sure those types of settings are kind of geared around the right way too. And I think finally, just also recognising that you can't look at these things in isolation. Obviously, there's food and fibre production sort of demands on our farmers, but also biodiversity sort of markets are sort of in the pipeline, and the nature repair market is on the horizon, an example of that. So making sure that we're not just looking at sort of single solutions or single approaches, but in terms of how we use our land, what we expect from farmers around food and fibre production, and all the other sort of ecosystem services that they provide, that sort of is coming through front and centre as well. So we're spending a fair chunk of this year developing the sector plan, and the conversations with many of you in this room and beyond will continue. It's an exciting space, and for someone who's sort of worked in the agriculture space for a couple of decades, to be honest, in different roles, it is for us sort of a new terrain and sort of a bit of a new framework for us to develop, and it's not often you have that opportunity. So we are very much seeing it as an opportunity to sort of shape how the sector can play an important role in Australia's net zero transition in the coming years and decades, and also I guess feeds into probably something that Rose is going to touch on in terms of what Australian agriculture might look like in 2050. And certainly when we started this work last year, 2050 seemed like an eternity away, and I think as each day and week passes, it seems to be getting closer at speed. So on that note, I'm happy to sort of take questions at the end, but looking forward to continuing to work with many of you in this room in quite an exciting space. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you very much, Nick, and I'm sure there are many of us here are going to be very interested to keep hearing about how that plan develops. Really exciting, ambitious agenda there. So next we have Dr. Rose Roche from CSIRO. Rose is CSIRO's research lead for Ag 2050, a DAF and CSIRO collaboration. Rose will explain her work on what Australian farming systems could, should and need to look like to be profitable, productive and sustainable. So over to you, Rose. And again, just a reminder to everyone, we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A afterwards, so do feel free to add in those questions as they occur to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And can I have the clicker as well? I was given instructions, so hopefully we do better with this than water bottles. Thanks very much. I'm really honoured to represent the Ag 2050 team, some of whom are in the room today alongside Nick, and give you a sneak peek in some of the insights that we've gleaned from the Future Scenarios report that CSIRO and DAF have collaborated on. I'd like to also start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose lands we meet on today, and I have the honour of living and working here in Canberra, and acknowledge their elders past and present. This is a first test for me, isn't it? Oh, there we go. In the past 12 months, we've had over 100 hours of consultations with over 100 stakeholders, both internally to our organisations and externally, and I can see quite a few faces in this room have given their time, so thank you very much. And what was really clear, as Nick mentioned too, is there is agreement and support for cross-sectoral, co-designed, evidence-based futures of what our landscape farming systems could, should and need to look like in 2050. And industry and stakeholders are really keen to understand what the necessary interventions, innovation and support is needed to achieve that vision. And so this report, which will be published soon, will be a critical input to continuing work for both organisations looking ahead for agriculture to 2050. The QR code on this slide links to a draft summary of the scenarios and has some initial considerations for next steps for industry, government and researchers. As I mentioned before, the full report will be published in early April. The objectives of this scenarios project is to create a set of plausible evidence-based scenarios to motivate discussions around what Australian farming systems could look like in 2050. It's important to note this means we didn't set out to predict what the future could be or how to get there. Our goal was to expand the scope and urgency of collaborative thinking between industry, researchers and government, and to develop a whole of sector plan for effective and equitable transformative change. And so how do we create these scenarios? We're really lucky in CSIRO to have our CSIRO Futures team, and they have developed these draft scenarios using an approach that combined input from participants in a co-design workshop series with a literature review and analysis, as well as more detailed scenario development process that the team followed alongside those workshops. When we began this project, we had over 30 scoping consultations and did a broad literature review and brought together several key themes that are impacting Australian agriculture to 2050. These were further tested and refined in our workshops and finalised to be climate and environment, land and water use, productivity and innovation, trade and market access in the global context. Now, noting that these aren't all the drivers, but these were what the ag, forestries and fisheries stakeholders identified as the priority drivers. Next, we identified the drivers of change within each theme. These are the global and national forces, megatrends and factors that have the potential to create uncertainty and change from Australian farming systems. I think when you look through that slide, there's none that are particularly surprising. Initially though, we had over 100 ideas, and so we ultimately prioritised and distilled them into this list of 14 drivers, aiming to cover the breadth of trends and forces. Many of these drivers are internal forces that we can influence. For example, climate change adaptations, emissions reductions and our trade relationships. But there are also, we know there are external forces we cannot control outside of the sector and Australia. And for the ones identified were changing consumer preferences as largely an export market and global collaboration on climate change and global geopolitical uncertainty. It's important to reflect that the future of these outcomes is not certain. The direction and speed of change could lead to different outcomes over the next 26 years. I find it really useful when we're thinking about the future to cast your minds back, if you can. Some people in this room may not remember 1994, but some of us do, and think about how close that is, how not so far away that is, but also how much has changed in that time. So we have that capacity. We then extrapolated from these to what we know from the literature and our experts to define at least two contrasting and plausible outcomes for each of these drivers. For example, there's a driver of integration and consolidation. Integration in the agricultural value chain and consolidation of farming businesses. One outcome we might see in 2050 is that the pace and rate of integration and consolidation follows past trends. Another outcome we might see is that these past trends significantly accelerate and exceed current trends, leading to oligopolies across agricultural industries which wield large influence over policy investments and investment. So then to create our scenarios, and this was the fun bit, if you're part of the workshops, it was really fun. We created a jigsaw puzzle of the outcomes for the drivers for these plausible futures. So, and together we created a huge range of scenarios. Over 30 scenarios were created in total. These were all collated and synthesised into a set of 4. These 4 were chosen because they focus on the most critical trade-offs, opportunities and complexities facing our farming systems. The slide you can see behind me shows you the different building blocks for each scenarios. The building blocks are the result of all this work on the drivers and different driver outcomes. For each scenario in the report and in this summary, there's a little narrative and a list of building blocks and also a set of signposts, sort of how do we know where we're heading. And I'll just read you the short narrative for each of these to give you a taste of sort of where the participants felt the future could be. So scenario 1, regional ag capitals. In 2050, large multinational corporations have consolidated and seamlessly integrated much of Australia's agricultural value chains. Leveraging transformative technologies, increasing levels of productivity have been unlocked. New workforce opportunities have emerged, but they are concentrated in a few select regional cities where multiple sectors are experiencing growth. Scenario 2 was named Landscape Stewardship. Here, using the land to support the energy transition through carbon capture and the restoration of the environment has become a national priority. Farming systems are resilient and productive as producers have taken advantage of a range of diverse income streams, blurring the lines between farming biodiversity, carbon sequestration and energy and fuel production. Scenario 3, climate survival. Without transformative change, the ag sector is forced to focus on surviving rather than thriving. Producers relocate and incrementally adapt and diversify their farming systems to offset the impacts of climate change. However, they remain uncertain about the long-term viability of their businesses. Scenario 4, system decline. The Australian ag sector in 2050 has reached a tipping point. Delayed and fragmented decision-making has left producers facing the economic and environmental consequences of extreme weather events and biosecurity outbreaks. With only incremental advances in agri-tech, many farm businesses are struggling to maintain profit. Now, there's clearly more sobering and optimistic outcomes. I'm an optimist, so I prefer to read those in reverse order. But I think what I really ask the room to consider is that each of these are a mix of desirable and less desirable outcomes. The future of agriculture may be a combination of these future scenarios, depending on industry, regional context, and global context, and the extent of actions that we take. But it's the trade-offs between these scenarios that can facilitate richer decision-making on the future that agriculture wants to pursue. As I mentioned, this is only the beginning of a 4-year program of work, and our next steps are to validate and test the feasibility of these national level scenarios and downscale them. We'll be working with farmers and First Nations stakeholders to raise their voices as to what their preferred futures are and help identify how we can support the innovation and science and policy changes necessary to address the challenges and capitalise on the future of ag. But we do need all of you in this room and beyond. It's no one organisation can meet this challenge. And just to finish off, I'd like not to shy away from the fact that the voices of our First Nations people are largely absent from this report. Recognising that gap very early on, we've received dedicated funding for an Indigenous Futures in Ag 2050 work package, which is led by Taurus Webb, who I think is in the room today. There he is. Hey, Taurus. And that's really important because we think that, we really need to understand and create partnerships with these communities and ensure that we have inclusive futures in agriculture and food. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Rose. That's really exciting work, and very much look forward to reading that report and seeing the next steps. So we do have just under 10 minutes now for Q&A from the audience. You can submit them online. I can see there's one here, but we also do have a roving mic, so don't be shy if you want to stick up your hand as well. I'm going to start with one of the online questions. Can we produce agriculture and food and deliver on land-based sequestration at the same time? Can emissions reduction and ag production move together? That's like the $24,000 question, whatever it is.
I think that's
Nick?
I think that's me. Although
Sure.
I prefer it to be you.
Yep. I think this is it's a good question, a good framing question. I think, and I think I'm an optimist too, like Rose. So I think the answer is yes. But I think there's going to be these drivers around demand for land-based sequestration, as well as food and fibre production and everything else, the biodiversity services and things like that I mentioned as well. And I think Sue is probably going to come up here soon and talk about natural capital as well. So it is, I'm not sure it's a black and white sort of one or the other. It is going to be sort of all of the above, to be perfectly honest. And I think particularly through some of the scenario work that Sarah has been doing with us and with different parts of the sector as well, trying to reimagine what food and fibre production looks like in 2050 in a lower emissions environment, a broader net zero sort of context, farmers being paid for biodiversity services, so things like a nature repair market. Those types of things are sort of going to increasingly sort of shape how our landscapes are used, and I certainly see it as more opportunity rather than sort of one of sort of pessimism or defensiveness. But that future isn't sort of fully defined yet. So part of what we're doing now is trying to set up some of those parameters around what we think good looks like and start to have that conversation.
Yeah, and it was certainly clear that land use trade-offs is the big one. We're working within the Ag 2050 program with the Australian Farm Institute, asking those sort of questions, and also what are the from a scientific point of view, what are the modelling capabilities? You mentioned Ludo. We need to be able to answer those sort of questions. I think someone mentioned at a forum last year that if we were to deliver all the promises of what we're going to do with our land, we probably need multiple Australias. So I think it's really important to see what's feasible, and that's what we're really hoping to unpack.
Great, thank you both. Yes, there's questions from here, so let's take one from here. Over there, yep.
Hi, thanks. May Lee from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm just interested in these scenarios and the fact that obviously globally we're also going to have a number of different countries facing perhaps a range of the scenarios that you put forth for Australia. In this context, how do we think about our trading relationships, our approach to different risks and shocks, and how might we think about maybe what undistorted trade and production can look like in a globe going through uneven sustainability transitions, or even perhaps not quite surviving through some of the climate shocks that you outlined in your scenarios? I'd be interested to hear if you've put any thinking to putting this in the international context. Thanks.
Thanks very much for the question, and I think it's really important. The participants said let's just have one context because it's too much. But in terms of the international community, there are the FAO has a consortium looking at this kind of scenarios building, and how do the scenarios link in to the global context. One of the really interesting things in this area is that often Australia's unique context is not necessarily seen. For example, we have a very large dry land component. We're largely export focused. And so it's really important, as you said, for us to have that connection of what are we thinking about our futures and connected to the global national scenarios. And so that's a part of I think the program is really exciting, because usually we kind of tag onto this kind of work, but we're kind of saying, here's our voice, and feeding that into those sort of global conversations.
Thanks, Rose. Interesting question. Yep. Clarissa, yes.
Thanks very much, everyone. Larissa Taylor from Western Australia. Great to be here. There's a few of us who've flown over. Two questions, probably to Nick. The first one is, Nick, what is the role of sustainable finance in this process? And the second one is, maybe not a question or a plug, thinking about the natural capital underpinning our food systems in Australia, would it be possible to contemplate having fisheries in this process? Thanks.
Yep, so maybe we can start with the latter first. Fisheries, so yes and no is going to be the answer. And I know we've been talking, I think some FRDC folk in the room, which we've been talking to over the last couple of months. The way the national inventory is constructed is kind of dictating sort of how the sector plans have been sort of set, which is why we're sort of focused on the agriculture and land sectors. But obviously all 6 sectoral plans will have to come together in a bit of a melting pot to sort of set out what the whole of economy net zero plan looks like, and that's where you'll have things like transport sector and renewable fuels, electricity, sort of decarbonisation. And they're some of the sort of big drivers of emissions in the fisheries space, but I'm not being exhaustive there, but that's just an illustration of, we are sort of looking at sort of the farm gate rather than the full transport supply chain, cold storage, international markets and food processing, which sort of just accounted for elsewhere in the inventory. So that's just a sort of reflection of how the sector plans are set out more than anything else. And your first question is around sustainable finance. So absolutely, and I know there are a lot of reps from the banking sector here as well. Obviously the Net Zero Banking Initiative, which many have signed on to as well. So we expect that'll start to play a role in terms of shaping sort of on-farm practices, and probably already has, and many farmers have very good relationships with sort of their accountants and bankers and things like that, and these are no doubt part of those conversations. But as I said in my earlier remarks, we are going to have to see the whole supply chain come together and coalesce around kind of what we want the sector to look like down the track. And so part of this is around, yes, absolutely the finance part of the supply chain, access to capital, but also manufacturing, the retailers, the ag input suppliers, the transport part. So we aren't being sort of exclusive in terms of thinking about what a common sense approach looks like here. So the short answer is yes, and it sort of adds to sort of the many threads that sort of cut across this and why we've had such broad interest in our process to date.
Thanks very much, Nick. Now, there are quite a few other questions, but we are actually at time for this part of the session. But I think some of these other questions will be quite relevant for the second part as well. So thank you very much, Nick and Rose, for sharing your very exciting work that you have underway. And we were going to do some musical chairs now and swap with our 4 panellists who are coming up. Thank you. So while they're coming up, I'm pleased to introduce 4 speakers to you who will each present for 5 to 6 minutes and then pass on to the next one of them. So, first one we have here, who is about to sit down, is Alex Baker, the CEO of Future Feed, who will speak on enteric methane solutions and a path to sustainable animal production, focusing on methane from agricultural and abatement approaches. Future Feed was established by CSIRO and holds global IP for the use of Asparagopsis seaweed as a livestock feed ingredient. And Alex has 30 years of experience with private and public companies, primarily in biotech and bioeconomy. And then second, here we have Rachel Palumbo, the General Manager of New Seed Australia, the seed division of the New Farm Group, which is an ASX-listed global agricultural innovation company. And Rachel will speak about how Australian farmers can help drive and benefit from the decarbonisation of liquid fuels. Third down the way, here we have Sharon Harvey, Senior R&D Program Manager for Wine Australia. Sharon led a project which delivered an emissions reduction roadmap for the Australian grape and wine sector 6 months ago, and she'll speak about that. Sharon holds a PhD in molecular genetics and has been at Wine Australia for 8 years, managing projects in the areas of grapevine germplasm, breeding and genetics, and climate adaptation and mitigation. And finally, we have Dr. Sue Ogilvie, Program Director of Farming for the Future. Sue has a PhD in natural capital accounting and is focused on the development of practical approaches to natural capital accounting at farm scale. Sue will give an overview of Farming for the Future, which is helping farmers measure and manage natural capital actions and understand its links to farm profitability. Sue will also speak about how carbon is now and nature is next, a great link to the opening discussion about the Ag and Land Sectoral Plan, which will address both climate and nature. So let's hear from this great lineup. So over to you, Alex.
Great, thanks very much, Jo. And good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and I just extend a thanks to the Outlook organisers for the invitation to speak today and address just a few points. I'm not going to have any slides. I was just going to talk to the point about enteric methane emissions and how that has a significant impact with respect to agriculture and what we can potentially do about that. And then really lead that into what is a pretty amazing innovation that's come from Australia, from our leading research institutes and universities that can potentially offer a solution, but also talk about some of the other solutions. So by no means do we see this as a one-size-fits-all approach to abating enteric methane from our animal production systems. I'll speak largely around beef and dairy. Obviously, followed second is our sheep animal population. So if we look at global numbers in terms of cattle numbers, we have somewhere an estimate of 1.5 billion cattle roaming the earth, doing wonderful things for us, and 1.3 billion sheep. So they're significant numbers of individual animals. But looking specifically with respect to Australia and thinking about our sort of our national herd and where that's sort of split up and where we can look to approach that. So we've got around about 26 million or so animals operating between beef and dairy production systems. Around about 1.2 million of those enter a feedlot system of some type, sitting within that feedlot system anywhere between 90 and up to 400 days of feedlot process before their point of slaughter. So we've got these animals running around and producing wonderful products that we export and consume domestically. And each and every one of them is producing methane. And by no means should we ever think about our wonderful cattle as the bad guys. The bad guys is actually sitting inside their stomachs, in their rumen. So over the evolution of the animals, basically methanogens have developed alongside the extensive microbiome that lives inside the rumen of the animal, which is really its energy production system. So those methanogens that have taken refuge in there and happily live there consume somewhere between 10 to 15% of the carbon input into the production of that animal from its point of birth through to its end. So we're producing, if you like to think of it in that regard, we're producing extra 10 to 15% of feed for that animal over its life because of the loss of that carbon. And that carbon is breathed out from the stomach along with its breath into the atmosphere. So if we actually looked at the amount of methane on a global basis, we're in the gigatons of emission. It's a significant amount. It's estimated somewhere between 60 to 70% of methane is the major emission basis for our agricultural system here in Australia. So it's a significant number, and it is a difficult challenge to address on how to actually, abate that methane. We've been studying the rumen for, possibly over 100 years, certainly with some intensity for over 50 years, trying to understand how it works and how to actually make it be more productive. Obviously, the more productive the rumen in ruminant animals, the more productivity we get from the animal system. So right there lies a terrific opportunity. There's two aspects that we can solve. One is essentially removing a major emission, and in that way it's not offsetting, it is directly removing. So we are abating an emission out of the inventory right there by stopping its production in the rumen. Secondly, if we can achieve that, that carbon's got to go somewhere. So if it's going into productivity, we end up with more food essentially in our supply chain. So both of those things we should be, fervently chasing and trying to find solutions for. Particularly the second part. I mean, the poor old farmer's out there, he's getting combated with all these other things he's being asked to do, or she's being asked to do these days, in terms of becoming, more carbon efficient, more sustainable, providing better margins and so forth. Now we're asking them to also, just take out the emissions that you guys are contributing as well. Well, that's easier said than done, but we're not giving them any other solutions in terms of how they can improve their own margins and profitability and productivity. So it's a major area of research. So to move to where FutureFeed sits in this, this system, we've been have been developing over now well over a decade solutions with respect to that. And the solution that we've come up with sits around using a particular red seaweed and feeding that to animals on a daily basis to abate the methane. So it has a direct effect on the microbes in the stomach, and it basically stops those microbes producing methane. The other effect we've now seen, and we've got statistical data coming out fairly soon to demonstrate, we've actually seen a productivity gain that's measurable and significant in the, potentially up to 7 to 8% productivity gains in terms of feed efficiency. So we can deliver that with abatement of methane for cattle producers, for dairy producers, and ultimately through to our sheep producers. We can give them tools to actually help remove the emission, improve productivity, and that overall directly contributes to our agri-economy, particularly for Australia, and potentially leads directly into our ability to maintain premium products. We can apply low carbon labels to export products, and also maintain market export in certain markets that are starting to put up barriers with respect to carbon intensity. So there's a range of things that we can do there, but our product is not the only one that can do this. There are others. It's all about how much you can actually take out of the system. So far, and we've assessed and looked at all the different solutions out there. There's a range of natural products, there's chemical products, and so far the Asparagopsis product demonstrates a consistent removal of 80% or more of methane being produced in cattle across a range of different systems, principally in beef. Now, one of the big challenges that we do have is I spoke about 1.2 million in feedlot. That means there's still 25 million running around the paddocks, and they pose a different challenge in terms of being able to get these interventions into those animals. So that is a large body of work that's underway at the moment, and we're pleased the federal government does fund this program through the MERRIL, the program through DQ. They've basically allocated $29 million over the period. They've just announced Merrill 3.2, which is again focused on grazing solutions to basically address, and abate methane within animal production systems on a grazing basis. So hopefully some good results come of that, and that helps Australia. But we're also looking to then take this technology to the world, so everybody can basically, look to benefit from these findings. So that's our short story for the moment. Takes the answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Great to hear. So over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you. We'll see if we get a slide, but if we don't, we'll make it work anyway. So thank you for the opportunity to come here today and share a little bit about New Farm's seed division, New Seed, and the work that we're doing around developing sustainable plant-based solutions to solve some of the challenges that we're talking about today. New Seed's at the forefront of oilseed innovation, and our focus is really on supporting sustainable food and biofuel production in Australia and beyond. We see opportunities to unlock new pathways for ag decarbonisation, and part of that is around the production of crop-based feedstocks for renewable fuels. And we believe that crop-based feedstocks can help Australian farmers lower their carbon emissions and help decarbonise hard-to-abate sectors such as aviation. Use of local crop-based feedstocks for renewable fuel production is really able to support this through increased removal and storage of carbon, as well as production of biodiesel that could be used in farm machinery longer term. The development of a local renewable fuels industry will really drive the scaling of feedstock production that will ultimately strengthen farmers' sustainability, productivity, and we're really focused on how this contributes to grower profitability and resilience ultimately. If we think about where we're at today in our renewable fuel journey around the world, liquid fuels are going to be a critical energy source for sectors such as aviation. We're not going to see an electrified long-haul plane anytime soon or in the foreseeable future. So really, we need to solve some of these challenges. If we think about the opportunity for Australia, well, we really need policies that can support the development of a local renewable fuels industry by incentivising supply and demand, the same as other countries have around the world. We've recently submitted our views to the Ag and Land Sector Decarbonisation Plan. Moving on to the second point, we really see that these new solutions can essentially create new value chains and markets for Australian growers. Recently, the CSIRO and Boeing published the SAF roadmap, and it highlights the potential of non-edible oilseeds, such as carinata, which I'll talk about, to meet bioenergy feedstock demand. And so non-edible oilseeds are essentially providing an opportunity of cultivating and utilising crops that don't compete with food and can actually grow on more marginal, degraded land and open up more marginal country. New Seed carinata can help Australian farmers to meet this rising demand that we see for renewable feedstocks, but at the same time contribute to reducing their emissions and improving productivity and sustainability. So you're probably wondering, well, what is carinata? It's actually not that dissimilar to canola, but it's a non-food oilseed cover crop. And at the moment, in different parts of the world, we contract grow this between main crop rotations. It's harvested, crushed, and then turned into an independently certified sustainable lower carbon oil feedstock. It doesn't compete with food or contribute to any land use change. as we specifically contract grow this between cover crops or as a break crop essentially. We have a global partnership with BP for new seed Carinata and a 10-year offtake agreement that will support the scaling up and production and processing of renewable fuels for end users. BP essentially buys that Carinata oil and then processes it into markets to supply sustainable biofuels. We see it as really a lower carbon drop-in replacement for fossil fuels. So essentially it decreases carbon emissions without retrofitting any of the existing fleets, including farm vehicles and machinery as well as aviation. We're quite excited that the development of the New Seed Carinata program is underway in Australia, and we're really focused on determining the right fit within the local agricultural system. So R&D trials continue across the country, but this year we're actually undertaking a commercial trial and we see a potential fit in the cotton system as a break crop, which could also help growers to address some soil disease pressures. If we think about Carinata, it can deliver these ecological benefits as well as economic benefits. So essentially removing atmospheric carbon and restoring soil carbon as it grows through its very extensive root system. And we also have a co-product from the oilseed crush. It produces a high protein meal, so this can also support our longer term food security. We believe that the New Seed Carinata program will actually help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the sowing, growth and harvest cycle, and we actually contract growers and commit to specific practices to be able to quantify and report on that. And as with all biogenic sources, Carinata removes atmospheric carbon as it grows, but because the carbon that is released upon combustion of end-use fuels is actually equivalent to that captured throughout the growth cycle, this harvested feedstock is considered to be a carbon-neutral, renewable source of energy. So ultimately, we know that the Carinata program must provide a clear agronomic and economic benefit for growers to be adopted. And so we're really focused on establishing what that value proposition is. And we're really aiming to help growers diversify their incomes and essentially deliver productivity and sustainability benefits through New Seed Carinata. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Very interesting. Now, Sharon, tell us about the wine industry.
Thank you, Jo, and thanks for having me. Let's talk about wine, everyone's favourite agricultural commodity. Sorry, Alex. So as
Beef
Jo's
wine, come on.
goes well. As Jo said, I'm a member of the Research and Innovation team at Wine Australia, which is essentially the RDC for grape and wine, I guess, and we have a couple of additional functions that sets us apart from the other RDCs, and those are to regulate the export of Australian wine, and we also have a role in international marketing. So I thought you might be interested to know what the impacts of climate change are and have been on the wine sector. So these are things that we've been seeing for probably a good couple of decades at least, and we've had to develop management strategies to cope with them. So these impacts are right along the production chain. On the left-hand side is the more agricultural side of things, I guess, prior to the value add, which is the wine. And in the vineyard, we're seeing effects on the way the grapevine grows. One of the particular effects we see is vintage compression, whereby grapes that used to ripen across a spread over several months, like whites first and then reds, are now ripening much closer together. In addition to that, everything's sort of marching forward. So all of our data tells us that, for example, in Shiraz, it's coming forward about 1.3 days per year. So what that means is everything's ripe at once, and it puts a strain on the winery infrastructure. which is not ideal. The other thing, I guess, is that our product is affected. So changing conditions mean that the lovely flavours and the colours develop differently in the berries, and so that can change the character of the wine, which then needs management at the winery level. So what are we doing about it? Obviously, it's a two-pronged approach. So we've invested quite heavily in adaptation previously, on the right-hand side of the slide here. And there's a number of both short-term and long-term adaptation mechanisms that we can use. But obviously, increasingly, there's an urgency around that mitigation conversation, and that is reducing the emissions that cause climate change. And although we're a small emitter, it's hardly the point. We've got the same regulatory and market drivers on us as on everyone else, and we all need to be part of that bigger picture. So our response to that has been the development of an emissions reduction roadmap for the Australian grape and wine sector. It's a project that I led, and we delivered it in September last year, and it was delivered by a sustainability consultant, Edge Environment. And there's three main components to it. There's the roadmap itself, which sets out the why and the what of emissions reduction. And then we have an emissions reduction guide that sits alongside that. That is essentially the how-to guide for Australia's grape growers and winemakers in emissions reduction. And alongside that is an assessment of various carbon accounting tools that can be used by the sector. So what the roadmap tells us is that we calculated the baseline carbon footprint of the entire grape and wine sector. So this is across all three scopes, and that was a 2020 to 21 baseline. So within that, we can identify the opportunities for emissions reduction, and we selected a number of those opportunities and we modelled them. And that gave rise to science-driven sector targets, and the roadmap also sets out how we can get there. So just briefly, the carbon footprint of the Australian wine sector is not very different from other agricultural commodities, and that is about 75% of our footprint derives from Scope 3 emissions, which is our products and supplies that we bring in, things like packaging and transport. And by packaging, of course, I mean glass bottles. But we've got about a quarter of our footprint that can be directly controlled by grape growers and winemakers, and they're the things that we can start to knock on the head first. The roadmap also digs a bit deeper into those vineyard and winery emissions and identifies where the opportunities are in the vineyard and the winery for reducing emissions. So this is really the headline of the roadmap. This is a waterfall chart, and I'm sure you can't see the detail here, but these are the 11 initiatives that we modelled that were chosen using various criteria, sometimes on the effect that the initiative might have, sometimes on the ease of implementation, but essentially they've been modelled out to 2030, and in doing that we recognise that there is a 42% reduction opportunity by 2030. And, you know, further to what Nick was saying, it doesn't mean that every business in the wine sector is going to be reduced by 42%. It means that across the sector and in our supply and production chains, we can achieve 42% if we implement those initiatives. And of course, we've got our wider goal, as Nick mentioned too, the net zero by 2050, and feeding into those wider government goals. So if you'd like to have a look at it, it's on the Wine Australia website. There's a landing page at that address, so feel free to go in and have a look, download it, tell me what you think. Obviously, this isn't a set and forget situation. We're going to provide amplification and support to the industry to implement the measures that are in the roadmap, and we'll also regularly review it. There should be more technology coming down the line that we can bring in, which is part of the reason why we didn't model all the way out to 2050. And we'll review our targets and see how we're going.
Thank you, Sharon. And last but not least, Sue.
Thank you very much. I don't have any slides. So I'm the Program Director of Farming for the Future, and we are an initiative that was seeded and initiated by a family foundation, the MacDoc Foundation. And we consider ourselves actually to be an agricultural research and change program. Our focus, and we are so thrilled to hear about all the initiatives here today, and particularly the recognition that while we do need to decarbonise, we also need to think about the production of food and fibre. Our point of view is that the other thing we need to consider also and know a little bit more about is what are the economic implications for farm businesses of decarbonising and taking into account all of these challenges that we need to take. So the role that Farming for the Future is playing is to catalyse the ability to understand the relationships between natural capital and decarbonising activities and the relationships between the productivity and profitability of a farm business and also the well-being of farming families. And so we see ourselves as revealing the business case for decarbonisation, for investment in natural capital. And we see ourselves as essentially answering the question of whether farms with greater natural capital or better environmental performance are actually more productive and profitable than farms with lower levels. In other words, answering the question of whether more natural capital will come at a cost to a farm business. So when we think about natural capital, at the Farming for the Future perspective would be it's every type of ecosystem you would expect to see on a farm. Everywhere from the intensified cropping soils through to pastures, vineyards, orchards, shelter belts, environmental plantings, remnant native vegetation. They're all the different ecosystem types of a farm, and therefore we consider them all to be the natural capital of the farm. Depending on what they are, they have different attributes of carbon and biodiversity. A remnant native vegetation has lots of carbon and biodiversity but doesn't produce very much food. An intensified cropping soil, not very much carbon and not very much biodiversity, but lots and lots of food production. And so when we think about natural capital, we're then thinking about what contributions it is making to the productivity and profitability of a farm business. So we know that shade and shelter, for example, is really important to the productivity of crop and livestock operations. We know that environmental plantings and remnant native vegetation can provide very, very important habitat that helps to reduce the predation of predatory insects and pest animals. And so when we think about our program and the way we decided to answer the question of whether natural capital is associated with differences in farm business performance, we've developed ways of measuring the natural capital in really high fidelity ways, very, very, very detailed sort of science grade information about a farm's natural capital. And we've measured it in such a way as we're revealing the capacity of the natural capital to provide those ecosystem services to production, as well as providing information on the public goods that farmers are generating when they're looking after their natural capital. So increases to carbon storage, as Nick mentioned being so important to the whole ag and land sector plan, and of course biodiversity for all of the benefits it brings. And so when we think about the natural capital measures, which is the focus of my talk today, what we felt was really important in our research was that when we made the natural capital measures of each farm that's participating in the project, and we have 130 livestock producers in the project at the moment in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania and WA. And with the help of our natural capital measurement partners, who are the NRM organisations and land care groups, we've been able to measure the natural capital in a very high fidelity way. And it's really important to do that because farmers need to be confident that the natural capital of their farms is being measured accurately. And I'll speak a little bit more to that point later on. But it's also extremely important that the natural capital measures actually give them information that helps them to manage. the most important thing we need to be thinking about here is enabling farmers with the best set of information that we can give them. So the research alongside the natural capital measures included the measurement of detailed farm business performance, so very detailed farm financial and production data, and that was enabled with partnerships with farm accountants and farm advisors. Again, having those collaborative relationships was very important to the project to not only get the data in the way that we needed it, but most importantly, to be able to inject their skill and experience into the program, and then to enable them to translate the findings from the research into practice with the clients that they had participate in the research. So Farming for the Future sees itself as kind of the back-end science organisation. We won't be providing bespoke, the context-specific, very, very personalised situational advice that's needed by farmers. So working back to the point about the really high fidelity natural capital information, one of the most important points, and Nick spoke about this earlier, is that our discovery of measuring natural capital at farm scale confirmed that the publicly available data sets and satellite imagery that's been designed to give policymakers and state governments and RDCs and many other users that sort of catchment scale information or regional information about ecosystems and vegetation is not at fine scale enough to be accurate for a farm. So we would say that while it's fit for purpose for that regional scale, when you get it down to farm scale, it's kind of wrong. And so one of the most important things that we think about is not only getting to that very high fidelity ability to measure natural capital, but also that question of attribution of change to natural capital, particularly when we're thinking about things like carbon storage. There are so many things that can happen on a farm that are beyond a farm manager's control. And some of the examples that we would report from experience with some of the participants in our study is that using the models that we use for measuring carbon storage at the moment, if you have done the right thing in Tasmania and cleared gorse from your land, and gorse is an invasive weed, it's going to come up as an emission event in your carbon storage numbers. And so if you've been subject to some eucalypt dieback on your property as well, it's going to look like an emissions event or a deforestation event. And so when we're thinking about the sort of things that are needed in terms of investment in the industry, we're very, very focused on recommending that a lot of investment go into giving that fine scale information. Because what we need to be thinking about, or our point of view is that when we're thinking about measuring and reporting natural capital and environmental performance on farms, and I can't remember who said it might have been Rose earlier, talking about Australia's voice at the international table, and I think that was something that Nick, you mentioned as well. It is extremely important that we are actually having quite a loud voice at the global conversation about this. What we often hear is a lot of talk about what farmers should be reporting to other entities in the sector about their environmental performance. We think that, yes, that's absolutely absolutely correct. But what we think is probably the really more important and useful thing to do is make sure that we're focusing on equipping farmers with the very, very best set of information we can possibly give you so that you can make the best decisions you can possibly make, and that everyone else in the sector should be actually organising around you to provide you the environment to make those great decisions and the environment to realise the opportunities that are in front of us in a decarbonising and nature positive landscape. And as Joe said, introducing me, we do get very focused on carbon at the moment, which is important. Carbon is very important, but we do know that while carbon is now, nature is next, and it's coming fast, and we're all going to wish we started 10 years ago. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sue. Really valuable work. So now we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. You can pose questions to any or all of these four experts here. So feel free to do that again. They can do it through raising your hand or through the app. But we're going to start with one question for all four of you, and maybe you can see if you can get this in a minute each. So thinking about the net zero plan for agriculture and land and the work that you've outlined today, what would you most want the sector plan to do? So maybe Alex, if we can start with you, minute each.
I think continue and increase the focus on innovation to find solutions. So we don't have everything in our toolbox. We need more things in our toolbox. But with respect to innovation, ensure that there is a focus on the impact on supply chain. So as I was talking about, looking at productivity and therefore profitability with respect to the primary production point, make sure that it then can flow all the way through. So that actually needs both technical innovation and business innovation sort of wrapped together. And so they're important things to look at. Yep.
Thanks, Alex.
Yes, I think for the establishment and development of a renewable fuels industry, we really need to think about the policy opportunities. And the first is really the policy settings need to foster a market-based and technology-neutral environment to attract investment in this part in Australia. The second priority would be to make sure that we think about having globally aligned standards and certification schemes so that we can remain internationally competitive from a feedstock perspective. And thirdly, we really need to quickly build demand for renewable fuels so that farmers have an opportunity to participate in this market in Australia. And some examples of where that has happened in other markets has been low carbon fuel schemes introduced, and that would be a broad market approach to really incentivise demand and development of a local industry. Thanks.
Yep, what Alex and Rachel said. For me, it's those, as Alex said, those sort of big ticket technical solutions that might lay across several agricultural sectors that could pull some serious levers for all of us. And maybe there isn't such a thing, but it would be great to identify them if they're out there. I think it's a valuable plan from an all-in kind of approach. This is something we all have to tackle, and I think people like to feel that they're part of a bigger moving thing, and we're all on the same bus, as it were. And I think also, I think it would be great if it could contemplate the activities that are already going on in sectors like ours and like in MLA, and activities also that a lot of the state governments have initiated too.
And what everybody else said, and then probably what I would do to finish up is to say that while we've already heard from Nick that the government recognises that carbon tunnel vision will actually constrain the opportunities, that value stacking, considering food, fibre, nature and all of the rest, that is exactly the sort of picture that we think we need. I think what Farming for the Future would be encouraging the ag and land sector packages to look, or the sector plan to look at, is we see the terrific work that's going on in markets for carbon and markets for biodiversity and nature positive activity. They're absolutely wonderful. We actually think that there's a substantial opportunity for carbon, biodiversity, resilience, farmer wellbeing, food security and productivity, actually focusing on investments in nature to support core production of core commodities. And so we would encourage good investigation of those opportunities and ways to help farmers realise them. We think that's going to be what will retain the greatest adaptive capacity in the industry, because farmers retain autonomy when they're looking at core production, whereas when they're looking at markets, then they have to do what is required by the market. So that's probably how I'd finish the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you all. Very insightful comments. Yes. Question there in the middle.
Hello, my name's Catherine Marriott. I'm a 2024 Nuffield Scholar, and my question is, Alex, to you around Asparagopsis. And I'm just curious around timelines for when you think that feedstuff will be economically reasonable for farmers and also at scale so that it could be widely adopted as a tool.
Yeah, and it's a great question. That's the conundrum that we're in terms of driving, essentially accelerating scale of the seaweed itself. Before the endeavour started, no one grew Asparagopsis. it's not a seaweed. There's a couple of small groups around the world that put it in their native foods. Terrific. So we're looking at our role in the piece. So we've done one piece of work, which is essentially licensing the technology to get adoption with different in hands of different people that were interested in growing and manufacturing the actual feed supplement. So we've got 9 licensees. We've got 5 in Australia and 4 internationally, 2 in the US, 1 Canada and 1 Sweden. So they are all looking at a particular cultivation methodology, and most definitely cost of goods is sort of the first thing that comes out of their mouth when you're talking to them, which is a good sign. So we've then said, okay, well, how else can we grow this thing? And there's really sort of 3 modes, if you will. In the sea, in a terrestrial concentrated mode where it's still using large ponds on an extensive basis, all the way through to a very biotechnological approach of densification and controlled culture in photobioreactors. So we're focusing on the bookends at the moment, trying to look at different regions that can grow seaweed, such as South Korea, who has a $1 billion industry. And so, of course, seaweed presents another potential agricultural commodity group that Australia could potentially benefit from here. Asparagopsis is only one seaweed, right? So if we can get something going here, it could expand, and there's certainly good work around blueprinting that, and FRDC's work with ASA. So there's a concentration around that problem. There are now some of the licensees have started actively feeding in commercial settings, small numbers of cattle, but it's the place to start. So I'd say, today, in the next 3 years, we will start to see slow growth towards, scale, feeding meaningful numbers of cattle. That product entering market and actually then testing out consumers as to their interest and sentiment around low-carbon beef. And that's something that we've got an idea about, but until you can walk into Woolies and select, then we don't really know what that means. Certainly the sentiment from what we've measured to date, people are interested in accessing that. But until we've got some supply on shelves, it's a bit of a question mark, yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Do we have other questions from the floor here? Yeah, there's one over here. Mike, over. Thank you.
Hi, Michael Taylor, another Nuffield Scholar. My other question was just answered, so that's good. But I was just wondering whether you had any comment, Nick, on the research that Murdoch have done in the side effects of Asparagopsis production, the bromoform, and whether that's been since discounted as an issue or not.
So all of the work that we've focused on has been around efficacy, safety and tolerability in animal systems. So all of our work has demonstrated that it's got a low to zero residue basis, so it's safe to feed. Animals are tolerant over many, many days. It's a sustained efficacy, so there's no adaptation to feeding the seaweed. In other words, say you can feed it, you get a reduction, and that reduction is sustained, so the rumen is not adapting through change and then starting to allow methane production to increase again. So that's essentially proven. We've published over 20 different studies that are all focused around animal animal systems. And so we continue to look at the profile of the safety, and it's obviously something that as we work into different markets, the different regulators will have different requirements, and we'll need to meet those, or our licensees will need to meet those. So it's one of those things that people are allowed to research what they like. We can't control what people look at, and some people have chosen to look at it in a particular way. There's no dispute, Asparagopsis contains a range of different bioactives. One of those bioactives are these halogenated metabolites. The most abundant species is bromoform. So that's one of over 100 different components within the seaweed. So we don't think it's the only active in there, but so far it's well tolerated and we believe quite safe. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. A question for Sharon. What do you think are the main barriers to the implementation of the Wine Australia roadmap?
There are many. I mean, I think the main one at the moment, as Tim alluded to this morning, is the current downturn in the sector. And so this isn't the sort of thing that is keeping producers up at night. We heard a couple of people during the consultation process for the emissions reduction roadmap that it's hard to be green when you're in the red, and I mean I think that's the main barrier that we're facing at the moment. There are a few others. I mean, one is that we've got a really diverse sector, lots of different sized businesses. We've got grape growers and winemakers separately, and then vertically integrated businesses, all different sizes, all different levels of engagement in this space, from 6 businesses that are certified carbon neutral to people who really haven't thought about it that much. So I guess the challenge is to be able to come in at all those different levels and bring everyone along for the ride in collective action.
Thank you, Sharon. And we have another online question for Rachel. So does biofuels production reduce agriculture's emissions?
Well, I guess that we would see the opportunity to use the biofuel in farm machinery. So there's an opportunity to reduce emissions by the use of the biofuel that's actually produced. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Do we have other questions from the room here? People are being a bit shy.
Actually, Rachel, that would be good in viticulture, because one of the things we identified in the roadmap is that there are fewer levers to pull in the vineyard than there are in the winery. So, and diesel's one of our big contributors to vineyard emissions.
And today, if we think about our canola industry, about 50% of our canola in Australia is produced in Western Australia, and the majority of that canola is exported to Europe for production of biodiesel. So we're helping to decarbonise other countries.
Yeah. Similar with tallow in Australia, but we won't mention the war.
Yes, question up the back.
Thank you. Tony Matchett from Cairns in Far North Queensland. So to Rachel and this conversation, I think it's a policy question. Is it the difficulty around getting support for the biofuel industry to see something like Carinata that's been an opportunity for nearly 10 years in Australia but hasn't eventuated for a whole range of reasons, needing to not displace canola as a food crop to grow the Carinata, or the lack of R&D support that a non-levied crop would see in the ag sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. If I think about it and why we've been able to get some traction in recent times, we've been able to find a fit in the agricultural system that doesn't displace a food crop. So we're not looking to put Carinata today where we grow canola. We're looking to fit it in a different place in the farming system. So our commercial trials this year will be in cotton as a break crop for growers. So it's not displacing their primary source of income. And the idea is that it would provide them with both economic as well as soil health benefits potentially. In terms of, from an R&D perspective, we're very focused on bringing Carinata varieties that are shorter season, have disease resistance, have herbicide tolerance, to be able to fast track the ability to fit it in to parts of the agricultural system where we are not displacing a food crop.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Any others? Well, let's see. There's a question here which is actually from the first session as well, so it might be a little bit more applicable to you, Nick, but I'll put it out there and you're welcome to jump back up. Is there political will to drive change when one short-term outcome will be an increase in the cost of living?
Nick's he's on the phone.
We'll leave that for him.
Yeah. I guess I'll put that to the panel here then. Do you see this as the sorts of solutions that you're talking about? Do you see them as potentially having an impact on the end prices for consumers or not? I think, Sue, what you've talked to it would suggest that's not the case.
Yeah, so our research is absolutely designed to help create ways in which we can work out where these trade-offs are, if they are, when they are, why they are. And so by trade-offs, I mean trade-offs with environmental performance and economic performance, which would translate to increases to cost of production, because the natural capital isn't actually reducing your inputs. So the sort of research we're doing at the moment is only focused on livestock producers, and we've got 130 livestock producers in our sample at the moment, which as far as we know is the largest data set ever of its kind ever assembled. What we think we're seeing is a bit of a signal that in livestock production that it might be the other way around, that there seems to be a positive relationship between the amount of natural capital on a farm, I say that in square quotes because it gets awfully geeky under there, and the productivity of the farm. And so actually what we think that's reflecting is farmers' ability to actually utilise the free inputs that are provided by nature and actually not be needing to be so reliant on inputs. So I do caution when we talk about our findings that we are not firing silver bullets here. Agriculture is just about as complex an industry as you can get, and so everything's very heavily nuanced and very situationally perspective, so I don't want anyone to get too excited, but we would say that there is substantial opportunity that's not yet explored for farmers to take better advantage of free inputs from nature, whether it's as alternatives to needing as much fertiliser or alternatives to needing chemicals and the costs and fuel associated with making and putting out chemicals. Over to you.
Well, we're actually at time now, so... But look, thank you so much for all the speakers up here and to Rose and Nick beforehand. I mean, as I think you've mentioned, this is an extraordinarily complex sector that we're working in. Maybe, to me, it always seems like it is the most complex of the sectoral plans. Maybe everybody thinks that about their own sectoral plans, I don't know. Probably do. But there's just, but there's also just so many opportunities ahead of us, and it really is exciting just to see the level of momentum and across government, across industry, across the research group to really be tackling all of these issues in very practical ways across policy and across all the technological innovation that needs to go on. So thank you again, and keep up the wonderful work. Thank you.